Episode 2, Trade Flows, Transnational Corporations and Conflict. This audiobook will cover lessons 7 to 12 from the Geography Superpowers topic. Information was procured on the appropriate booklet, worksheets, and PowerPoint presentations. Lesson 7, Trade Flows. Trade is important as it is often seen as the engine of growth. Terms of trade tend to be skewed in favor of superpowers through control of commodity prices and the production of high-value goods. Influence or voting rights in the major economic IGOs are related to economic power, which could be seen as self-serving IGOs are dominated by developed countries and as such reflect Western interests. China and Southeast Asia has global trade flows worth more than 1% of global GDP with Western Europe, the USA, and Canada. In 1980, the largest trade flows were between the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. There were more than 250 global trade agreements between the years of 2013 and 2015. Global trade dropped by $3 to $5 trillion in 2009. South Asia and East Asia have both doubled or more than doubled their GDP between 1980 and 2000. There was a 533% increase in the amount of East Asian trade flows between 1980 and 2000. North America's GDP grew by $4,200 billion between the years of 1980 and 2000. The International Monetary Fund was established in 1994 and is based out of Washington, D.C. It currently has 189 members. Its aims to promote global economic stability and security and help countries to reform their economies. It also promotes international monetary cooperation and exchange rate stability with the aim of reducing poverty. 44 countries initially joined to create a fund, mostly paid for by the wealthiest nations, to be used for loans to help those countries facing heavy debts after the 1930s depression and the Second World War. The thinking was that poverty and communism would be prevented and capitalism promoted. Provides finance for governments to enable them to pursue development through investing in infrastructure projects. Voting rights are proportional to the amount invested. The USA, for instance, is the largest investor with 17% of the votes, and just 8 countries control 47% of the votes between them. It does also reflect American and European interests. For example, during the Cold War, it loaned money to stabilize those countries threatened by communism. It is usually led by a European person and so has been criticized for not representing the developing world and emerging economies they provide assistance to. It imposes conditions on those borrowing money. For example, developing countries could be asked to privatize public resources such as water networks or cut spending on health or education in order to free up more money to pay debts. The World Trade Organization was established in 1995 and built its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. It aspires to remove trade barriers and promote global free trade in order to improve the welfare of the people in the member countries. It was formerly known as GATT, 1947 to 1994. It has 159 members. It has removed barriers to trade to help ensure a more prosperous, peaceful, and accountable economic world. It has considerable powers to judge trade disputes, and it has brokered many agreements aimed at promoting free trade. Average tariffs on trade have fallen dramatically, and world trade has been increasing at a much faster rate than GDP, though this has slowed down following the 2008 global economic crisis. Unlike the IMF and World Bank, the WTO operates a system of one country, one vote, which is in theory fairer to developing countries. When trade barriers are removed, TNCs get more access to developing markets, which benefits MEDCs at the expense of LADCs. While most people agree that free trade does generate wealth, they deny that all countries benefit from it. No votes have ever been taken at the WTO. Most decisions take place by negotiation until agreement is reached. This is time-consuming, and the economically powerful nations usually get their way. In Africa, in negotiations with the EU, countries have been forced to eliminate tariffs on up to 90% of their trade because no clear rules exist to protect them. One aim is to help the world's poor by reducing farm subsidies in developing countries, but the rules are difficult to apply. Even though subsidies are not permitted by WTO rules, they exist widely for EU and American farmers. Lesson 8. Transnational corporations. TNCs have been around for a long time. Most famously, and during the 18th and 19th centuries, much of India was run by the British East India Company. By 2015, there were over 75,000 TNCs. The top 200 TNCs produced 25% of the world's economic output by value. 75% of the world's largest 2,000 companies are based in just 10 countries. It is estimated that TNCs account for 80% of global trade. TNCs help their country of origin to dominate the world economy and maintain power as well as wealth. TNCs have a cultural influence over other parts of the world. The dominance of the USA since 1990 and the economic power of the EU has led some people to identify this increasing cultural globalization as Westernization. This global culture involves the arts, food, and media and is dominated by consumerism, capitalism, and wealth creation. It is an anglicized culture with English as the dominant language, and it cherry-picks and adapts selective parts of other world cultures and absorbs them. Global culture is most often exemplified by the ubiquity of consumer icons such as Coca-Cola and McDonald's. In the case of McDonald's, 36,000 restaurants worldwide serve about 65 million people. Every day, 750 people buy a McDonald's every second. Another important source of influence is the media. News feeds, films, music, and TV are dominated by global media brands, most of which are from the USA. Programs such as The Simpsons are available in almost every country and on every streaming channel, such as Amazon Prime. This gives the USA the ability to constantly reinforce its cultural message and values, often in a very subtle, unseen way. Interestingly, many IT companies and even retailers have branched out to become content providers in recent years. This includes Google, Amazon, and Apple. This linkage of cultural content, which is often Western to IT and communications technology, makes it a very powerful delivery system. The same globalization applies with food. As people return from holidays or work trips overseas, wanting the same flavor or experience to remind them of their visit, the influence of international foods in supermarkets in the UK has spread. TV chefs such as Rick Stein and Madhur Jaffrey have become global foodie celebrities. TNCs have had huge impacts on the increase in global trade. Part of the reason for this is the global shift in manufacturing to Asia by TNCs. Since 1990, the shift has led to rapid increases in exports from emerging countries. This has not only shifted economic power away from Western economies into emerging economies, but has also made TNCs extremely powerful. As dominant economic players, TNCs gain enormous influence over governments and international bodies who are afraid of the potential jobs losses and resulting social costs if TNCs shift their activities elsewhere. Walmart is the world's largest retailer and the largest company by revenue, as well as the largest private employer in the world, with 2.3 million employees. As a company that is economically more powerful than most countries in the world, it is able to exert considerable influence globally, both economically and politically. In recent years, there have been increasing numbers of mergers and acquisitions as TNCs compete for a larger global market share. This results in some TNCs becoming so large that they have the power to influence market prices and can absorb, take over, or simply drive out smaller competitors. As a result of greater economies of scale, Walmart is able to offer products at such low prices that it is often impossible for smaller local and national businesses to compete, and they consequently suffer reported sales declines of up to 40%. As a result of mergers and acquisitions, sometimes companies that you have never even heard of actually own some of your favorite brands. For example, Mondelez International and American TNC own famous billion-dollar brands such as Oreo and Cadbury. TNCs can be so large that they effectively control the market of the product they specialize in. For example, the De Beers Group effectively had total control over the diamond market at one stage, though opposition has since dismantled the complete monopoly. However, the company still sells approximately 35% of the world's rough diamonds, and as such a key player, they have significant influence over the supply chain, global pricing, and profits. An often overlooked role of TNCs is the invention of new technology and the development of new products and brands. TNCs and governments invest huge sums in research and development to develop new products. Intellectual property law protects these new developments in the form of patents for new inventions and technologies, copyright for artistic works, such as music and books, and trademarks to protect designs such as logos. Patents usually protect the rights of the inventor for 20 years, during which time they will be able to make a profit from their discovery or innovation. Any person or company wishing to use one of the above has to pay a royalty fee to the inventor or designer. Globally, over 85% of all royalty payments go to the USA, EU, and Japan. This allows them to continue to grow in economic strength at the expense of developing and emerging countries. This domination of global royalties reflects that existing superpowers and developed countries are paid for inventions and artistic works they created decades ago. Developed world 10Cs are in the best position to invest in R&D, so patent holders tend to also be new patent developers. Education levels are higher in already developed countries, as are skill levels. Westernization and cultural globalization tend to spread US and European music, film, and TV and brands. Often, American TNCs such as Apple and IBM dominate the world of patenting. IBM, a technology company, has been focused on research and development for more than a century and regularly tops the US list of annual patent recipients. They have a team of over 250,000 scientists, researchers, engineers, developers, and technologists, and spend over $6 billion per year on R&D. In 2020, they received over 9,000 patents. While Apple may not have as many patents, its products are iconic, and the development of the iPod, the iPhone and iPad has transformed how people work, communicate, listen to music, and interact socially. Apple has become known for its active and aggressive enforcement of its intellectual property interests, with famous patent battles such as that against Samsung. Recently, there has been a shift with rapid acceleration in the number of patents applied for by Asian countries such as China, South Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia. While the number of patent applications from traditional parts of the world like the USA or Europe haven't decreased, the rate of acceleration from emerging countries has become a lot stronger. In 2019, China overtook the USA to become the biggest source of applications for international patents for the first time. In some countries, particularly China, TNCs operate under tight state controls, and some strategic industries, namely banking, energy, telecommunications, and transport, are state-owned. Although private individuals may own a small number of the shares, TNCs operate much like government departments. The advantage of this is that governments can invest in long-term development such as roads, railways, ports, and renewable energy to drive economic growth. The disadvantage of these state-owned companies is that they can become corrupt, discourage private investment and innovation, and are vulnerable to accumulating large levels of debt as a result of inefficient operations. Following the privatization policy of the 1980s and 1990s, few state-owned companies are left in the UK and the USA. Only a few companies remain state-controlled in the UK, either in the public interest such as the BBC, or where safety is too high a priority to be left subject to financial priorities. For example, the National Health Service and the National Nuclear Laboratory. Having lots of state-owned TNCs operating within a country means that all profits are returned to the state and that the government can influence where to invest and who to buy and sell from, all of which increases a country's power considerably. China is well known for its large-scale investment in Africa, sometimes referred to as neo-colonialism. Chinese ownership of critical infrastructure in Africa and elsewhere could seriously undermine a country's national security if there were to be a conflict. It tends to be within emerging superpowers, such as China and Russia, that a lot of the TNCs are state-owned. In China, the 10 biggest companies are all state-owned. State-owned companies are also common where governments have a strategic interest. For example, in most OPEC countries, the governments own the companies extracting their oil, such as Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia. Gazprom is a Russian state-owned company, and it is the largest gas supply company in the world. It controls 1/3 of the world's gas reserves and accounts for 92% of Russia's gas production. Control over such a crucial resource has allowed the Russian government to extend its influence globally. Some critics have accused Russia of using its gas as a geopolitical weapon, increasing prices and reducing or even shutting down supply to countries such as Ukraine when they began to seek closer ties with the EU and NATO in 2008. There has been a dramatic shift in origin of the world's largest companies since 2005, reflecting the rise of the emerging powers. While close to 400 of the world's largest 500 TNCs originate from only 7 countries, China's share of those has risen at the expense of the USA and EU countries. As TNCs in emerging powers continue to grow in size and strength, there has been a recent trend in reverse colonialism where poorer, previously peripheral countries such as India begin to invest in richer traditionally core countries such as the UK. This arguably results in a shift in power to the emerging power. The Tata Group is an Indian multinational company that employs over 750,000 people globally. Its companies include Tata Steel, Tata Motors, and Tata Power. Although over a century old, the company has more recently gained international recognition after purchasing a number of global brands such as Tetley Tea and Jaguar and Land Rover. When Tata took over the Anglo-Dutch steelmaker Chorus in 2007, it was given a mixed reception in the UK due to worries about future job uncertainties. The company employed over 15,000 people across the UK. The issue hit the headlines again and again, with Tata announcing thousands of job losses as well as plans to sell its UK steel business. A key concern for workers and the government during this time was that these crucial decisions lay in the hands of a foreign-owned company. British Steel Limited was most recently purchased by Chinese company Jingyi Group in 2020. Lesson 9. The United Nations. The UN is an IGO where representatives of 193 countries meet to discuss matters of peace and security. It was set up in 1945. It was set up to prevent another world war, promote human rights, uphold international justice, and promote social progress. It encompasses UNESCO, FAO, and UNICEF, and works in various areas, namely economics, social policy, human rights, and culture. It can boast of eradicating smallpox, and its peacekeeping and refugee operations have been awarded Nobel Prizes. It was partially responsible for the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, and Millennium Climate Agreements. It currently has 16 separate peacekeeping missions. The UN Security Council is the primary global mechanism for maintaining international peace and security. It has 5 permanent members, specifically the USA, UK, France, China, and Russia. The 10 other members rotate on a 2-yearly cycle. The permanent members can veto any resolutions that are suggested. Due to ideological differences between USA, UK, France and China and Russia, this can often lead to paralysis. The Security Council can maintain international law by applying sanctions to countries that are deemed to be a security risk. For example, economic sanctions against North Korea were agreed in 2017 following missile tests, which escalated tensions. The sanctions prevent North Korea from exporting goods, costing them up to $1 billion in trade losses. It can authorize the use of military force as it did in the Gulf War, 1990-94, a UN-authorized force of 660,000. Troops from 30 countries pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait. They are also responsible for authorizing UN peacekeeping forces. However, in Rwanda, the force failed to prevent the Rwandan genocide, which left 800,000 dead. The International Court of Justice is the judicial branch of the UN and is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. It settles disputes between UN member countries and advises on international law. Its judgments are generally binding and ICJ has 15 judges who represent different global regions. As with the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members. They are involved in hearing a case brought by Ukraine against Russia, accusing Russia of illegally annexing Crimea and illegally funding separatist rebels. It is yet to conclude. The annual UN climate conferences aim to make progress in managing climate change. Since 1995, each conference has tried to establish legally binding requirements for all developed countries to reduce greenhouse gases. The 2015 Paris Agreement is hoped to be the most successful global agreement. It aims to engage all countries in committing to significantly reduced emissions. Lesson 10: Crisis, Conflict and Alliances. Example 1: a military alliance. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was first formed in 1949 at the start of the Cold War. It originally had 12 members and was established to assist Western Europe in alliance with the USA and Canada in responding to the threat of the USSR and its allies in Eastern Europe. It adopts the guiding principle that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This has been invoked just once after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. It now has 30 members, with Eastern European countries on Russia's border joining NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This military alliance collectively accounts for most of the world's firepower, including nuclear weapons. Members of NATO carry out regular military exercises on each other's territory. They have also been involved in training Afghan and Iraqi security forces to combat terror threats in the region. Since 1991 and the end of the Cold War, NATO's influence has diminished to such an extent that its role and cost is now being questioned. President Trump, for example, called it obsolete, and President Macron, who called it brain dead. President Trump criticized member nations for not increasing their defense spending, resulting in the USA spending by far the most money, in large part to protect Europe. NATO members are required to spend 2% of GDP on defense, but more than half fall below this threshold. On the other hand, Russian military activity in Ukraine and Crimea, as well as Russian naval and air exercises in European waters and airspace, have brought NATO to the fore again. And more recently, NATO has focused their attention on the challenge that China presents for the first time. With increasingly frequent Russian and Chinese vetoes of UN Security Council proposals, the USA acts either alone or with its NATO allies, thus increasing the organization's significance. Example 2, an economic alliance, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN comprises 10 Southeast Asian countries and was formed in 1967 to encourage greater cooperation and economic growth between them. Members include Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines and Vietnam. It also aims to increase political, military, educational and cultural integration amongst its members. In 2016, a single market was introduced across ASEAN so that goods, services, capital, and skilled labor could flow freely between member countries. ASEAN could be considered the most successful regional grouping in the developing world. It has raised living standards for many of the 600 million people living within member nations and has helped to promote peace and geopolitical stability within the region. However, many of ASEAN's member countries have experienced huge economic growth on their own, and with young populations, the political will to work together has not been very strong. Example 3, an environment alliance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC was first established in 1988 by the UN in order to provide the world with a clear scientific view on the current situation of climate change and its potential environmental and socio-economic impact. It produces reports to support the main international treaty on climate change, which aims to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that prevents dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. The IPCC does not fund its own research. Instead, it monitors scientific, technical, and socio-economic publications and assembles evidence, enabling UN members to understand the risks created by climate change and its impact. Thousands of scientists from all over the world contribute to the work of the IPCC. However, some critics claim that the IPCC tend to underestimate dangers and understate risks, and there is a tendency to focus on problems rather than solutions. The most recent IPCC report was released in 2021 and has been called a Code Red for Humanity. It claims that human activity is changing the climate in unprecedented and sometimes irreversible way. It urges countries to act fast and says that climate catastrophe can be avoided if the world comes together urgently in order to tackle the challenge. Example 4 and 5, 2 military alliances, the Australian, New Zealand, and United States, as well as the Australia, UK, and USA security treaties. ANZ-US is a 1951 security agreement that bound Australia, New Zealand, and the USA to cooperate on military matters in the Pacific and beyond. From Australia and New Zealand's point of view at the time, ANZ-US offered protection against a possible future threat of Soviet or Chinese aggression. For the US, ANZ-US represented a secure stake in the Pacific as it sought to strengthen its alliances around the world in its efforts to contain communist powers. The alliance was partially suspended following New Zealand's anti-nuclear policy of the 1980s, and today's meetings take place between Australia and the USA. Some commentators have stated that the alliance is no longer fit for purpose and needs to be renegotiated in the context of modern-day threats such as terrorism. In September 2021, the UK, USA and Australia announced a new military alliance called a UK-US. This was created in response to China's rapidly increasing military spending and more frequent military exercises in the area, as well as escalating tensions with North Korea. The alliance was condemned by China as extremely irresponsible. They claim that the pact seriously undermines regional peace and stability and intensifies the arms race. Western commentators have said that the move shows that the three nations are drawing a line in the sand to start to counter China's aggressive moves in the Pacific region. Example 6, an economic treaty, the European Union. The EU began as a trading alliance of 6 countries in 1956 with the view that increased interdependence would reduce the likelihood of another continental war. It has now enlarged to 27 members, down from 28 following Brexit, and it is both a free trade bloc and a political bloc. Within the EU, a complex set of supranational institutions exists to ensure the implementation of common standards, which forces the countries to work together causing frustration for some when faced with the burden of supporting struggling economies. Some countries in Europe prefer to opt in to the free trade market, but not to the political union. Since the EU began, its remit has been extended to include elements such as free movement of people and a common currency for 19 members. Its principle is that economic strength ensures against poverty, and it adopts a policy of convergence to reduce inequality between its richest and poorest members. Its influence also extends into environmental. Its social concerns are underpinned by a legal framework established in 1945, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is enshrined in all European law. The UK voted to leave the EU in 2016, and there are increased tensions between those who support greater convergence and right-wing political parties calling for separation. Lesson 11: Superpowers and Resource Use. A Chinese firm sent 6,400 employees on 4-day holiday to France. This was the biggest tour group ever to visit France. The company booked up 140 hotels in Paris for the trip. The group was expected to spend almost $15 million in total. China has the world's highest number of outbound tourists, and its visitors rank first in the world for expenditure, spending $165 billion during holidays. China becomes biggest market for red wine. 1.86 billion bottles of red wine were sold in China in 2013. This represents an increase of 136% over 5 years. The USA remains the biggest market for wines of all colors. China's meat imports expected to soar 3,500% by 2050 to $150 billion. China now consumes twice as much meat as the USA. Between now and 2050, China will represent nearly 40% of the increase in world food demand. China used more cement in 3 years than the USA did in a century. Scientists estimate that the global cement industry accounts for around 5% of the world's carbon emissions. More than half of the world's cement production capacity is based in China. China is urbanizing at a historic rate as more than 20 million Chinese residents relocate to cities every year. Iron ore prices soar on the back of China's plans to boost growth. Trade in iron ore makes it the world's second biggest commodity market by value after crude oil. China is by far the largest importer of iron ore, with nearly 2/3 of the global exports going to China. The price of iron ore rose by nearly 20% in a single day in 2016 after the government announced plans to boost growth by increasing spending. Lesson 12: Superpowers and Climate Change. Scientists have determined that if temperature rises surpass 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, this will lead to substantial and dangerous climate impacts, which will hit the world's poor in particular. The Paris Agreement sets out a firm goal of keeping temperature rises well below 2 degrees Celsius and will strive for 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was adopted by nearly 200 nations. There are no penalties for missing targets, and countries have submitted their own plans and targets to curb emissions. The UN is relying on peer pressure to keep driving countries forward. Developed and developing countries will all work to reduce their emissions and try to achieve a zero-emissions economy by the end of this century. Globally, carbon dioxide emissions rose by 53% between 1990 and 2013. In that same period, China's emissions increased by 286%, over 5 times the rate of global increase. China is now the world's largest carbon dioxide emitter, with almost 1/3 of emissions. Like other developing and emerging economies, agreements to cut CO2 emissions could limit China's economic growth. However, attention has now shifted to the costs of environmental degradation and the associated poor global reputation for pollution. China has agreed to work towards an emissions peak in 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. China positioned itself as a global climate leader following Trump's announcement to withdraw the USA from the Paris deal. China has focused on low-carbon technologies as the technologies of the future and been able to establish its dominance as an innovator as well as a manufacturer and exporter. For China, the opportunities that tackling climate change offered began to be seen as the engine of the next phase of prosperity. They are by far the biggest investors in renewable energy, and by 2030, 25% of energy generation should be from non-fossil fuel sources. It is still highly dependent on coal, but its coal consumption is predicted to peak and start to decline by 2030. China already boasts the world's biggest installed capacity of wind and solar power, and it is the world's largest manufacturer of wind turbines and solar panels. China accounts for over 80% of global solar panel production, with mass production reducing the cost of solar panels by 80% in the last decade. The country builds 2 wind turbines every hour. China's per capita emissions are, however, still rising, and this is hardly surprising given that it is still developing, industrializing and urbanizing at a rapid rate. It should be a concern that China's emissions per person are now the same as those of an EU citizen, given that average per capita income in China in 2014 was $8,300, whereas in the EU it was $34,300. China's emissions could grow much higher as affluence increases. Decisions that China makes on emissions therefore have a disproportionate impact on global emissions because its share and potential for growth is so large. Many say that any global reduction agreement would be meaningless without China. However, it is worth pointing out that from 1850 to 2007, the USA emitted 339,000 million tons of CO2, or 28.8% of all cumulative historic emission, to China's 105,000 million tons, or 9%. If the USA isn't willing to take radical steps, why should China? Obama championed environmental policies during his presidency and worked to transition the USA towards a low-carbon economy. President Obama signed up to the 2015 Paris Agreement and introduced measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through greater energy efficiency, promoting renewable energy and carbon pollution standards for electricity generation. Obama's 2015 Clean Power Plan was hailed as the USA's strongest ever climate action. Trump defunded the Clean Power Plan soon after taking office. President Trump is skeptical about climate change and announced his intention to withdraw the USA from the Paris 2015 agreement in 2017. The USA formally left in 2020, even though almost every other country in the world has signed up. Trump claimed that it was a bad deal for America, a job killer, an economy strangler, and a massive redistribution of us wealth to other countries. He said, "The rest of the world applauded when we signed the Paris Agreement. They went wild. They were so happy for the simple reason that it put our country at a very, very big economic disadvantage." By withdrawing from the deal, Trump was following in the footsteps of his Republican predecessors, such as President Bush, who rejected the Kyoto Protocol from 1997. This has led many to say that the USA is simply not a global leader as far as climate change is concerned, and leaves countries to look elsewhere for leadership. On President Biden's first day in office in 2021, he signed an executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement. Within months, he had announced plans to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030, more than doubling their prior commitment. He also announced that the US would double their funding for developing countries to help them deal with the impacts of climate change. Under Biden, the US is trying to retake its position as a global leader in the fight against climate change. He claims that this is the decisive decade, the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. The EU reflects the belief of many Europeans that climate change is the most serious problem we're currently facing. It has been at the forefront of climate initiatives. These include carbon trading, emissions reduction and grants to encourage renewable energy. The EU committed to cutting its greenhouse gases by 20% by 2020. Other commitments included a 20% improvement in energy efficiency and a 20% increase in the share of renewables in the energy mix. The EU also runs the world's largest emissions trading scheme, which encourages companies to reduce their emissions. Large emitters are allocated a cap to how much they are allowed to emit, and if they emit less than their permit, they can sell their allocation. The EU ETS covers more than 11,000 factories, power stations and other installations, which are collectively responsible for close to half of the EU's emissions of carbon dioxide. The total of all the permits allocated is reduced over time to reduce overall emissions and keep the price of permits high to encourage investment in green technology and innovation. The EU has remained a global leader in terms of tackling climate change and pushed hard for global agreements on emissions reductions. This culminated in the signing of legally binding emissions reduction targets in Paris 2050. The EU's Paris target was to reduce emissions by at least 40% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. In 2021, as part of a newly agreed EU climate law, they raised this to 55% with some pushing for an even more ambitious target of 60%. There are a number of commitments from member states which continue to demonstrate the EU's determination to tackle climate change. For example, France has said it will no longer use coal to produce electricity after 2030 and that they would ban the sale of all new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2040. Countries such as Norway are going a step further, aiming to be carbon neutral by 2030 and phasing out the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2025.